In the summer of 1940, two passionate field researchers, Sydney and Georgia Wheeler, set out to explore a network of dry caves in Nevada's rugged Stillwater Range, about 13 miles east of Fallon. Although they had never received formal archaeological training, years of experience had earned them a reputation for uncovering traces of the region's distant past. Working under the Nevada State Parks Commission, their assignment seemed straightforward. Search for ancient baskets, woven reeds, and other fragile objects that the desert climate had preserved for centuries. During the second day of their expedition, they entered an unremarkable cave that would eventually become one of the most significant archaeological sites in North America. Inside, they uncovered the partially preserved remains of an adult man. His body had been carefully wrapped in woven tool mats, and fragments of a rabbit fur robe still clung to his frame. The dry desert air had naturally mummified his skin, while the shallow burial suggested he had been respectfully laid to rest by members of his own community. Based on the archaeological knowledge available at the time, the Wheelers estimated that the burial was between 1,500 and 2,000 years old. The remains were catalogued, stored in the Nevada State Museum, and largely forgotten. For decades, they attracted little scientific attention because nothing about the discovery appeared extraordinary. Everything changed more than 50 years later. In 1994, anthropologist Irv Taylor of the University of California, Riverside, decided to examine the remains using accelerator mass spectrometry, one of the most advanced radiocarbon dating techniques available. Small samples of hair and preserved tissue were carefully analyzed. When the laboratory produced its results, the age was so unexpected that Taylor repeated the entire test to verify the findings. The second analysis confirmed the first. The individual, later known as the Spirit Caveman, was not 2,000 years old. He had lived approximately 10,700 years ago, making him the oldest naturally mummified human ever identified in North America at that time. His life stretched back thousands of years before the rise of ancient Egypt, long before the Great Pyramid stood on the Giza Plateau, and even before many of the technological milestones that define early civilization. For more than half a century, one of the continent's oldest human remains had quietly rested on a museum shelf in Carson City, without anyone realizing its true significance. What had once seemed like an ordinary burial suddenly became an extraordinary glimpse into the earliest chapters of human history in the Americas. Yet determining the mummy's age solved only part of the mystery. Scientists still faced far more difficult questions. Who was this man? Which ancient population did he belong to? Were any living people directly connected to him? Finding those answers would require breakthroughs in ancient DNA analysis, years of legal disputes, and the determination of a Native American community that refused to abandon its claim to the remains. Only after decades of scientific research and courtroom battles did genetic evidence finally reveal the truth. The results reshaped long-held theories about the earliest inhabitants of North America and forced researchers to reconsider assumptions that had dominated archaeology for generations. To appreciate why the Spirit Cave discovery transformed the study of American prehistory, it is important to understand the remarkable preservation of the remains and the people who first uncovered them. Sydney and Georgia Wheeler were not university professors or laboratory scientists. They were dedicated explorers who had spent years studying the harsh landscapes of the Great Basin, the vast desert regions stretching across Nevada and into parts of Utah, California, Oregon, and Idaho. Their practical knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable. They understood which caves were most likely to preserve delicate organic materials that would have disappeared in wetter climates. Recognizing their expertise, the Nevada State Parks Commission asked them to survey caves throughout the Stillwater Range as part of a statewide effort to document prehistoric archaeological sites. Neither the Wheelers nor the officials who hired them could have imagined that one modest cave would contain evidence capable of rewriting a major chapter of North American history. The work was systematic, music, but not glamorous, examining cave floors for fragments of basketry, cordage, sandals, and other perishable materials that rarely survived in the archaeological record. Spirit Cave was one of dozens they examined that summer. The cave itself is modest, a shallow overhang in the volcanic rock of the Stillwater Range overlooking the Carson Sink. The sink is a remnant of ancient Lake La Hontan, a massive Pleistocene lake that once covered much of western Nevada. By the time the Spirit Caveman was buried, the lake had retreated to a fraction of its former extent, leaving behind the alkaline flats and marshlands that characterized the region for the next 10 millennia. The burial was not deep. The Wheelers found the body in a shallow pit wrapped in twined tool mats woven from the bulrushes that grew in the marshlands below the cave. The weaving was sophisticated. The preservation was extraordinary. The man had been buried with care. He was wrapped in at least 2 layers of matting. Fragments of a rabbit fur robe covered portions of his body. He wore leather moccasins. A woven matting headdress, or cap, covered his skull. The positioning of the body and the presence of grave goods indicated intentional burial, not accidental death, not abandonment, but the deliberate interment of someone who mattered to the people who buried him. The dry cave environment had prevented the bacterial decomposition that would have destroyed the soft tissue in wetter conditions. The skin had desiccated rather than rotted. The hair was preserved. The internal organs had mummified. This was not Egyptian-style mummification. No embalming, no removal of organs, no wrapping in linen. This was natural mummification produced by the arid conditions of the Great Basin. The result was a specimen of extraordinary scientific value. The Wheelers recognized that the burial was old. They estimated 1,500 to 2,000 years based on the style of the basketry and their general understanding of Great Basin chronology. They were not equipped to do more precise dating. Radiocarbon dating had not yet been invented, and Willard Libby would not develop the technique until 1949, nearly a decade after the Spirit Cave discovery. The remains were transported to the Nevada State Museum in Carson City, where they were cataloged, stored, and largely forgotten. For the next 54 years, the Spirit Caveman sat in museum storage. Researchers occasionally examined the textiles. The basketry techniques were studied, but the remains themselves attracted relatively little attention. A 2,000-year-old burial, while interesting, was not exceptional in the context of Great Basin archaeology. The 1994 redating changed everything. R. Irv Taylor was a professor at the University of California, Riverside, and one of the leading figures in radiocarbon dating methodology. Accelerator mass spectrometry, known as AMS dating, had revolutionized the field by allowing the dating of much smaller samples than traditional radiocarbon techniques required. A few milligrams of material could now yield precise dates that previously would have required destroying large portions of a specimen. Taylor applied AMS dating to samples from several ancient Great Basin specimens, including the Spirit Caveman. The result was approximately 10,600 to 10,700 years before present. Taylor ran the analysis again. The result held. The Spirit Caveman was not 2,000 years old. He was not 5,000 years old. He was among the oldest human remains ever recovered in the Western Hemisphere, a direct window into the population that had inhabited North America at the end of the last ice age. The redating transformed the specimen from a curiosity into one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history. It also triggered a conflict that would last for more than 2 decades. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, was signed into law on November 16, 1990. The law was designed to address a historical injustice. For over a century, the remains of Native American individuals had been excavated, collected, and stored in museums and research institutions across the United States. Thousands of skeletons had been removed from burial sites, often without the consent or knowledge of the descendant communities. The remains were studied, measured, displayed, and in many cases simply warehoused in institutional collections with no intention of return. NAGPRA required federal agencies and institutions receiving federal funding to inventory their collections of Native American remains and associated funerary objects. It established procedures for the repatriation of those remains to lineal descendants or culturally affiliated tribes. The law was transformative, but it contained ambiguities that would prove contentious when applied to ancient remains. The key concept was cultural affiliation, the requirement that a relationship of shared group identity be established between the remains and a present-day tribe. For recent burials, cultural affiliation was often straightforward. Oral histories, archaeological context, and documented tribal territories could establish clear connections. For remains that were thousands of years old, the question became more complicated. In 1997, the Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe filed a Nagpra claim for the Spirit Caveman's remains. The tribe's traditional territory encompassed the Stillwater Range and the Carson Sink. Their ancestors had lived in the Great Basin for as long as their oral traditions extended. The Spirit Caveman had been buried in their homeland. From the tribe's perspective, the cultural affiliation was obvious. He was their ancestor. The Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, which administered the cave site, disagreed. The BLM argued that the remains were too old, that 10,700 years of separation made it impossible to establish the shared group identity that Nagpra required. The cultural distance was too great. The evidence of direct connection was insufficient. In 2000, the BLM formally denied the repatriation request. The decision was not made in isolation. It reflected a broader controversy that had been building in physical anthropology since the mid-1990s, a controversy over who the earliest Americans actually were. Scholars debated whether these remains were ancestral to modern Native American populations, and whether the question could be resolved through skeletal analysis alone. The Paleo-American hypothesis was the center of the controversy, and it became the focal point for competing claims about ancestry and identity. Certain physical anthropologists, most prominently Douglas Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution and Richard Jantz of the University of Tennessee, had been studying the skulls of early American specimens and arguing that they showed cranial features distinct from later Native American populations. The argument was technical, and it rested on craniometric analysis, the measurement of skull dimensions and proportions. That analysis identified apparent differences between ancient specimens, like the Spirit Caveman, and the skulls of more recent Native American individuals. The ancient skulls, according to this analysis, showed features more similar to some Asian populations, or potentially to populations like the Ainu of Japan. The implication was dramatic. If the earliest Americans were physically distinct from later Native Americans, perhaps they represented a separate population, a Paleo-American population that had been replaced, absorbed, or displaced by the ancestors of modern tribes. Under this hypothesis, the Spirit Caveman might not be ancestral to the Falun Paiute Shoshone at all. He might represent a population that had vanished, a population with no living descendants, no cultural continuity, and no connection to any present-day tribe. The hypothesis was convenient for those who wanted to retain the remains for scientific study. If there were no descendants, there was no one to repatriate to. The Paleo-American hypothesis was applied most prominently to another case that emerged in the same period. Kennewick Man, approximately 9,000 years old, was discovered on the banks of the Columbia River in Washington state in 1996, and he became the subject of a 17-year legal battle that paralleled the Spirit Cave controversy. Music 5 tribes claimed Kennewick Man as an ancestor. A coalition of scientists, led by Owsley, sued to prevent repatriation, arguing that the remains were too old and too physically distinct to be culturally affiliated with any modern tribe. The court sided with the scientists. For nearly 2 decades, Kennewick Man was studied, measured, and analyzed, while the tribes who claimed him as an ancestor were denied access to his remains. The Spirit Caveman became entangled in the same controversy. When the Bureau of Land Management denied repatriation in 2000, it cited the Paleo-American hypothesis as a factor. The physical distinctiveness of the remains, the Bureau argued, raised questions about cultural affiliation that could not be resolved without further study. The Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe refused to accept the decision. They appealed. They litigated. They refused to compromise on the fundamental question of whether their ancestors were their ancestors. In 2006, a federal judge ordered the Bureau of Land Management to reconsider its decision. But the controversy continued. The scientific community was divided. The physical anthropologists who favored the Paleo-American hypothesis wanted to continue studying the remains. The tribes wanted their ancestor returned. For years, the dispute remained unresolved. And then, ancient DNA technology matured to the point where the question could be definitively answered. Eske Willerslev is a Danish evolutionary geneticist based at the University of Copenhagen, where he directs the Lundbeck Foundation Geogenetics Center. He is, by most assessments, one of the leading figures in the field of ancient DNA research. His laboratory has sequenced genomes from some of the oldest and most significant human remains ever recovered, including specimens that directly address the question of who the first Americans were and where they came from. The technology that Willerslev and his colleagues developed allows the extraction and sequencing of genetic material from ancient bones and teeth, material that has degraded over thousands of years, but that still retains enough information to reconstruct ancestry and population relationships. The technique had already been applied to the question of early American ancestry. In 2014, a team led by Morten Rasmussen, working in collaboration with Willerslev and others, published the genome of the Anzac child, a 12,600-year-old infant buried with Clovis tools in Montana. The Anzac genome was definitive. The child was genetically ancestral to modern Native American populations. There was no discontinuity, no replacement, no evidence of a separate Paleo-American population. The Clovis people were the ancestors of the tribes who still lived on the land. The Anzac finding was devastating to the Paleo-American hypothesis, but it was a single specimen. The question of whether Spirit Cave, Kennewick Man, and other ancient individuals showed the same pattern remained open. David Reich at Harvard Medical School assembled a team to conduct the most comprehensive ancient DNA study of early American populations ever attempted. The research program sequenced genomes from dozens of ancient specimens across North and South America. It integrated data from Willerslev's laboratory, from Reich's own team, and from collaborators across multiple institutions. The Spirit Caveman was included in the analysis. The results were published in 2018 in two major papers, one in the journal Cell led by J. Victor Moreno-Mayer and colleagues, and one in Science led by Cosimo Post, Nathan Nakatsuka, and Reich. The findings were unambiguous. The Spirit Caveman was genetically continuous with modern Native American populations. He was not a Paleo-American from a distinct music-replaced population. He was not ancestrally distinct from the tribes who had claimed him. He was specifically related to the Falun Paiute Shoshone and to broader Native American lineages that had inhabited the Great Basin for the entire period since his burial. The DNA evidence directly contradicted the craniometric analysis that had been used to argue against cultural affiliation. The skulls might look different by certain measurements. The genes told a different story. The man who was 10,700 years old in the Nevada cave, music, was exactly what the Falun Paiute Shoshone had always said he was. He was their ancestor. The Kennewick Man case reached the same conclusion. In 2015, ancient DNA analysis confirmed music that Kennewick Man was genetically ancestral to modern Native American tribes, specifically to tribes of the Pacific Northwest, who had been claiming him for nearly 20 years. The Paleo-American hypothesis collapsed. Music. The physical anthropologists who had argued for cranial distinctiveness were forced to acknowledge that the skeletal features they had identified did not reflect population discontinuity. The earliest Americans and the later Americans were the same population, changing over time as all populations do, but maintaining genetic continuity across the entire span of human habitation in the Western Hemisphere. The legal implications were immediate. If the Spirit Caveman was genetically ancestral to the Falun Paiute Shoshone, the cultural affiliation that NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, required was established. The Bureau of Land Management reversed its position. In 2016, the remains were transferred to the Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe. The tribe reburied their ancestor at an undisclosed location, returning him to the land where he had lived and died over 10 millennia ago. The 20-year fight was over. The Kennewick Man case followed a similar trajectory. In 2017, following the DNA confirmation of Native American ancestry, the remains were repatriated to a coalition of Columbia Basin tribes and reburied in a private ceremony. The parallel victories represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between scientific institutions and indigenous communities. For decades, the scientific establishment had assumed the right to study ancient remains regardless of tribal objections. The Nagpare process was treated by some researchers as an obstacle to science rather than a recognition of indigenous rights. The DNA evidence changed the calculus. The argument that ancient remains were too old to be culturally affiliated, that the passage of time had severed any connection between the dead and the living, was no longer tenable. The genetics proved continuity. The ancestors and the descendants were connected by an unbroken line of inheritance stretching back to the first peopling of the Americas. The implications extend far beyond the specific cases of Spirit Cave and Kennewick Man. The ancient DNA research program has fundamentally rewritten the understanding of how and when humans populated the Western Hemisphere. The traditional model, the Clovis first hypothesis, held that humans entered the Americas approximately 13,000 years ago, crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia and spreading rapidly through the hemisphere. That model is now obsolete. The Monteverde site in Chile, dated to approximately 14,500 years ago, provided the first widely accepted evidence of pre-Clovis occupation. The White Sands footprints in New Mexico, dated from 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, pushed the human presence in the Americas back even further into the depths of the last ice age, when massive glaciers still covered much of North America. Modern genetic research has revealed that the story of the first Americans is far more intricate than scientists once believed. In 2015, geneticists Pontus Skoglund and David Reich reported evidence of an unexpected ancestral signal, often referred to as Population Y, in several indigenous groups living in the Amazon. This discovery hinted at ancient genetic connections that could not be fully explained by the traditional theory of a single migration across the Bering Land Bridge. Rather than one straightforward journey, the settlement of the Americas now appears to have unfolded through multiple migrations, different travel routes, and thousands of years of population movement. Human history in the Western Hemisphere was shaped by a series of complex events instead of a single wave of explorers crossing into a new continent. Within that larger story, the Spirit Caveman occupies a crucial place. His DNA clearly identifies him as part of the original ancestral Native American lineage from which the indigenous peoples of the Americas descended. He was not the last survivor of an unknown civilization or a member of some mysterious vanished race. Genetic evidence showed that he belonged to the same ancestral family that eventually gave rise to native communities still living across the continent today. For the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe and neighboring indigenous peoples of the Great Basin, these findings confirmed what had been preserved in their traditions for countless generations. Their stories describe an uninterrupted presence in the region, dating back to a time before written history, when massive lakes covered much of the basin, and the landscape itself was still changing. Elders passed these accounts from one generation to the next, as records of their people's origins. For many years, however, these oral histories were dismissed by much of the archaeological community. They were often viewed as cultural legends rather than reliable historical evidence. Scientific interpretations frequently took precedence, even when they conflicted with the knowledge preserved by the communities themselves. Ancient DNA analysis changed that conversation. The genetic evidence strongly supported the tribe's long-held belief that their ancestors had occupied the Great Basin continuously for thousands of years. Instead of contradicting indigenous history, modern genetics reinforced it, demonstrating that traditional knowledge and scientific research could point toward the same conclusion. The journey of the Spirit Caveman became far more than the story of a single archaeological discovery. It evolved into a powerful example of how science, law, and indigenous rights gradually converged. From his discovery in 1940 to decades of incorrect dating, Years spent in museum storage, groundbreaking genetic testing, lengthy legal disputes, and finally, his return to his people. Every chapter reflected changing attitudes toward archaeology and cultural heritage. The case also marked a turning point in the relationship between researchers and indigenous communities. For much of the 20th century, it was common for scientists to excavate, study, and retain ancestral remains without the approval of descendant tribes. Indigenous requests for the return of their ancestors were frequently dismissed as emotional or political, rather than supported by evidence. Advances in genetic science forced that perspective to change. Again and again, DNA studies demonstrated that many ancient remains were directly connected to the native communities who had claimed them all along. The relationship was not simply cultural or symbolic. It was biological, extending across thousands of years of uninterrupted ancestry. The Spirit Cave Man rested beneath the Nevada desert for approximately 10,700 years. After his discovery, he remained in museum collections for more than 5 decades, and later became the focus of nearly 20 years of scientific debate and legal proceedings. Eventually, following the confirmation provided by genetic testing, his remains were returned to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe. The tribe reburied him in a private ceremony at an undisclosed location, honoring traditions that regard such places as sacred. The exact site has never been revealed, reflecting the community's belief that some parts of their heritage are not meant for public display. In the end, the most advanced DNA technology ever applied to his remains confirmed what the tribe had maintained from the very beginning. He was one of their ancestors. Years of skull measurements, competing theories, and academic arguments could not overturn the genetic evidence linking him directly to the people who had fought for decades to bring him home. Today, the Spirit Caveman rests once again in the land where he spent nearly 11 millennia. His story has transformed more than a single archaeological case. It has reshaped our understanding of the earliest history of the Americas. It demonstrated that scientific discovery and indigenous knowledge are not necessarily opposing forces. When considered together, they can reveal a more complete and accurate picture of humanity's distant past, rewriting one of North America's oldest historical chapters through the life of a single man whose legacy endured across more than 10,000 years.